My talk is called Don't Panic, What to Do When Your Data Breaks. This is not a talk about data quality testing. There are already many great tools out there for letting you know when your data breaks. This is a talk about what you and your team should be doing after those alarms have gone off. This is a talk about your incident response. But who am I to talk about this? My name is Matilda. I am a data analyst for the product department at a company called Incident.io, which is an incident management platform that does things like alerting, on-call to incident frameworks and workflows. As a data analyst, I am very familiar with the many ways that data can fail us, from inconsistent numbers in a dashboard to broken pipelines to something as severe and critical as a data breach. And that is why we have so many great tools out there for letting you know exactly when and how your data broke. Automated alerting, unit testing, data quality testing. But what I would like to argue today is that if you do not have a proper incident response, you are not getting the best use out of those systems. In the same way that your company is probably invested in fire alarms for your offices, if your first response to those sirens going off is to panic and run for the elevators, you're probably not getting the best use out of them. Furthermore, by not having a standardized incident response, your organization is missing out on a ton of insight into where your team's effort and time is going. So, today, I would like to talk a bit about why I, in the past, have found data issues to be somewhat stressful, and I am unfortunately hoping that a lot of you in the room can relate. Then I'm going to talk about the 4 steps that the data team at Incident stole from the software engineers to make data issues run and feel a bit smoother. And I'll leave some time for questions at the end. I care quite a lot about incident management in data, and in order to talk about why, I'm going to have to talk about my first major data failure. This is me. I started working in data about 7 years ago, and this is a picture from when I was young and happy, and I hadn't written any data quality tests, and I didn't know what a primary key was. But eventually, I had my first big break, edge. I obviously cannot tell you what the details of this data issue was, so I'll leave it up to your imagination to imagine a horrifying event happening in your company, like a coffee machine being broken. What happened isn't important. What is important is how I and my team felt during that incident and how we felt in the aftermath. So let's start from the beginning. We noticed that the coffee machine has broken, and we flagged this in a public channel. Hey, we've seen it, and we're working on a fix. And I jump on trying to investigate what has happened. But before I can get anywhere, I am getting DMs from stakeholders wondering what happened, when can I get coffee again? My teammates are also DMing me, and rumor about the coffee machine has spread, so now conversations are happening in other channels as well. And I find myself bouncing between DMs and channels and back to DMs, trying to remember who has said what, where, and when. So communication is a bit frantic, but we don't really have a coordinated response. So everyone is trying to help out, but that leads to a lot of duplicated work. And for these reasons and many others, investigation is slower than we would have liked, because we're bouncing between code and Slack. Did I say code? I meant coffee machine, back to GitHub, and back to Slack again. But eventually, obviously, a fix was found and implemented. And in the aftermath, we decided to hold a post-mortem. And if you're not already familiar, a post-mortem is a meeting that is held after an event to discuss what can be better done next time, what happened, and what can we learn from it. But what I found was that even the people who had been most closely involved in the incident didn't really have a clear timeline of events. And even if you wanted to go back and try to manually piece together what happened, a lot of conversation had happened in DMs, which meant that no one in the organization had a clear idea of what had happened. So I left this post-mortem knowing how to fix the coffee machine should it break again. But I couldn't help but to feel like something was missing from this discussion. So that was the story of my first data failure. But it wasn't the first time I'd seen data break. I'd seen data break quite a lot. But they would have been bugs that I would have looked at in 10, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe an hour. Who knows? And when I got to the end of the week, my manager would ask me, what have you been up to this week? How's that project you're working on going? And I would say, I didn't really have time to work on that because I don't really know what I've been doing. A lot of workload had disappeared into this time sink of generally fixing things. So, in summary, I find that data issues can be very stressful as they are happening, and they can be frustrating, especially if they are happening over and over again. And a lot of organizations don't really know how long your data team is spending on them. However, there are ways to mitigate this, because now I work with a lovely set of software engineers. And when I look across the bank of desks at how they handle breakages and failures, they do not seem to share my frustrations. They will have an entirely separate set of frustrations that I shall not go into. And that is because software engineering have an industry standard on how you manage these things. And we as an industry are very good at taking inspiration from software engineering. I think that this should be one of those cases. So, the data team at Incident.io sat down, and we looked at what the engineers were doing. And these were the 4 steps that we decided that we would implement for ourselves. So, for the next 10 minutes, let's go through them together. Number 1, you should treat everything like it's an incident. When I said incident earlier, your thoughts might have gone to this big show-stopping event, but in the future, that is not how I would like for you to think of incidents. Instead, I would like for you to think of incidents as any data issue going wrong. So minor issues like a broken pipeline or a broken dashboard, that's an incident. And a data breach is quite obviously an incident. But the point is that we are applying the same process no matter how minor or major or critical that issue is. And we have a few good reasons for doing so. Number 1, it allows you to practice the process. When you step out on stage to do a talk at Coalesce, it should hopefully not be the first time you said any of these words out loud. You should hopefully have a few low-stakes rehearsals at your back. In the same way, when something goes wrong, and something will always go wrong, you want your data team to know the process like the back of their hand, to give them the best chance of success and resolving that incident as fast as possible. Second reason is that it encourages a transparent and blameless culture. An incident or a data issue is never the end of the world. And when something happens, it's very easy to hide away in DMs. But by doing so, you're missing out on a ton of knowledge sharing, and your organization doesn't really know how often this happens or what's going on. And the third reason for declaring incidents for all data issues is that it allows you to gather data about your data processes. And I'm going to talk more about this in step 4, so please put a pin in that for now. So, we're going to start declaring incidents and record them. And now, you are going to establish a responder rota to look at those incidents. What do I mean by this? Imagine that you come into work and you realize the pipeline broke. And you look at it and you think, should I pick that up? Maybe someone else has already picked it up. I don't really know if it's my responsibility to pick that up. And meanwhile, your team might all be thinking the same thing. It's very easy to fall into the approach of, well, the person who broke it should fix it. But that's not going to scale with your organization. it's not always going to be obvious what made the pipeline break in the first place. When something breaks, you ideally want to fix it as soon as possible. And this level of ambiguity of responsibility is going to slow you down. And it also causes a bit of stress and maybe a little bit of team fracturing as well. So, how do we resolve this? Consider having, much like the engineers have an on-call responder, a data responder. A data responder is the first person on the scene when something happens. They are responsible for triaging the issue, making sure whether it's an actual issue or not. Maybe the pipeline just needs to be rerun. They are responsible for determining the severity of the issue, and if there is an issue, they escalate it to the responsible team. Ultimately, they are not responsible for fixing the issue. They can be, but that is not the primary point of a data responder. They are there to make sure that issues do not go unnoticed. So, what does this look like in practice? This is the setup that we have between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. office hours. I was on call when this screenshot was taken. And I know for that entire week, when issues come in, whether they are reported by a colleague or whether they come in via one of our alert systems, I'm the one who picks that up. And the next week, my colleague Lambert is going to take over that responsibility and give me a bit of a break. We're a small team, so this sort of weekly rotation works very well for us. But if you're a larger team, or maybe you manage several teams, and they might have different needs or SLAs, or might be responsible for different parts of the pipeline, this is an example of how we have chosen to solve this, albeit small. So, I appreciate the text is small. I'll walk you through it. We have two pipelines running in parallel. One of them, the top one here, is customer-facing. Customer-facing data needs to be fixed at all hours of the day, and it needs to be fixed a lot faster. So, when we get an alert saying that this part of the pipeline has been affected, we escalate it immediately to an on-call engineer. And if there is an error in the rest of the pipeline, in any of the internal data, we escalate to a data responder. Now, you can create as many branches as you like, associate different parts of the pipeline with the different teams, but the point is that no matter who gets paged or who gets told about a data issue, they know that it's their responsibility to pick it up. So, your data responder has been notified that there is an issue. They've looked at it and determined that, yes, that is indeed an issue, and they are going to now create a dedicated space specifically for this incident. Whatever means of communication you have in your company, consider creating a new space every time there is an incident. Yes, even if you already have tons and tons of channels, you can archive them later. And yes, even if the incident seems too small to do so. Remember, we're applying the same process no matter how minor or major the incident is. And now that you have that one space that is unique to this one incident, you put all of your communication in that space. And everything relating to this incident should also be in this space. And you might think, that sounds really annoying. I don't really want to have to do that. That's a lot of manual work creating a new space every time something happens. And I agree with you, which is why you should automate it. No matter how you choose to do this, you should try to make it as easy as possible to go from something has happened to new space created to start investigating. So we have an alert source set up to DBT. So when something happens, we get an API call with information that lets us know a lot of information about what has failed. It also sets up a new space. And now that we have this space, we're using all of that metadata in the API call to populate that space with information that the data responder might find relevant. This is an example of such an API call. You can see the repository there. That's how we know who should be paged. But there's a lot of other great information in there, such as Who was the last GitHub user to create a PR for this repo? They might have some great context on what's been going on. And once you have all that information, you can greet your data responder with a message like this to help them get started with their investigation. Everything that they need is already there. You can see that the last person who committed a PR to the build was me. Oops, I'm also the data responder. I have many reasons to want to resolve this incident. So I'll let everyone know that I've seen it, and I'm working on it, and then I attach my PR in this one space. And now, if anyone is wondering, why is the data not updating? Why is the pipeline down? I can put any stakeholder or any teammate that might be helping me into this one space. Because it's a lot easier to put all of your stakeholders in one basket than to chuck individual baskets at each stakeholder. I don't want this to go unsaid either. You have your incident responder and you have your space to discuss that one particular incident. For each incident, you should also consider having an incident lead. The incident lead is also not responsible for fixing the issue. They are responsible for making sure the incident gets resolved. They are the ones coordinating the response, making sure that everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing, and making sure that no work gets duplicated. If they are not writing comms themselves in the channel, they are prompting others to do so. Now, in a minor incident, it is not uncommon for the data responder and the incident lead and the person who fixes the incident to all be the same person. But when something major happens, consider having this person be entirely separate from investigation. Because you don't want the person who's actively trying to put out the fire to be also busy trying to lead people out of the building. So, we've been doing a good job so far, declaring incidents, recording all those incidents, and now we've collected a lot of great data. And now we're going to put that to good use. By declaring incidents for every issue that you have a record of exactly where you have been spending your time. And now you can start aggregating that data to create great metrics like how many times did we have incidents this week or this month or this year? Are there parts of the pipeline that keep breaking more than others? Is there someone who is always fixing incidents? Maybe it's time to do some knowledge sharing and make sure that everyone in the organization is able to pick this stuff up. This is work you're going to be doing anyway. You're always going to need to fix things. You might as well know what you've been spending your time doing and have something to show for it. So one of my favorite metrics is active time spent on incidents. This is measuring sort of timestamps in the Slack channel to see how much you've been speaking there. And that's another great reason for why you want to keep your comms in that channel. If you do it in DMs, that doesn't count. And it's very satisfying to be able to go to your manager and say, yeah, I didn't get much done this week, but I've spent 15 hours in incidents because this one script keeps breaking. We should probably look at refactoring that. So we implemented these steps, and this is how it's going. We've done a lot of automation, and we've practiced the process quite a bit. So we have removed a lot of stress and workload for data issues. And because we have streamlined the process, we're also a lot faster than we used to be. But the main thing is that we're able to regularly review our past incidents and identify trends on things that just isn't working for us, or things that keep on breaking, or things that can be changed or fixed or removed. I am not immune to data issues. This industry is always going to face data issues, no matter how much we try to prevent them. There are many, many ways to do incident management. This is just one way. This is the way we've chosen to do it. The only thing I ask is that you choose one way to do it, choose a way to do it, and think about how you handle data issues in your organization. Like I said, I'm not immune to data issues. But the difference is that when the coffee machine breaks again, I'm not as scared and I'm not as stressed. Because I've done this 100 times before, and I know where the fire exits are. Thank you very much for listening. Are there any questions? We have a microphone coming around, sir.
So my question is about, you mentioned that when there is an incident, you want to populate the Slack space or whatever channel it is with metadata. If you don't know what caused the breakage, how would you programmatically sort of inject that metadata into the space? Or have you run into that issue, and have you thought about the ways in which you could mitigate that sort of thing?
Yeah, so there's always going to be like more data that you can add that in some incidents might be like some data might be more relevant than others. The way that we populate our sort of welcome message is that we show you what test failed, and then also like usually there's like a link to the Circle CI, because that will usually get you started. But if you are not operating, you might have an incident that's not a test failure, then you were not able to populate that metadata. You might use something else. But so far, we have not run into that issue because it primarily works with testing issues. Sorry, microphone.
Couldn't the extrapolation of this process result in like a formalized knowledge base that people could tap to address these problems when they occur?
I mean, I would love that. I think that we should have that. You mean within the organization?
Right.
Yeah, you can use this information to collect a database on previous incidents and how you resolve them. I think that's like a really great idea. So yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk to me about the difference between the data responder and the incident leader? You said that neither is responsible necessarily for fixing it, but maybe those are the same person, or is there a reason to keep those two delineated?
I would say that the incident lead and the data responder can absolutely be the same person, but the primary point where you want to keep the roles separate is if you're in a major incident, and your incident lead shouldn't also be like the fixer. So data responder, incident lead can absolutely be the same person, but yeah, consider having them just be the coordinator when you have a major thing going on.
Back on tracking the amount of time it takes to resolve the issues, for medium and low priority, was it elapsed time, or did you somehow get hands-on keyboard time? I mean, for higher priority, it's the same, right? But for lower priority, it may not be.
So this is some estimations that we do, but it's not keyboard time, it's like the timestamps in Slack, basically. So I think we make an estimation of like if you've been, let's be speaking continuously, you might be having spent like some amount of time in that incident. So it's not a perfect system.
So you said you took a lot of principles from software engineering. Are there some more principles that you're looking to add to improve your process, or this is everything they're doing and we're just copying one for one?
Good question. This process works really well for us now, but as we scale, we might be looking at implementing more stuff from software engineering. Nothing specific that comes to mind now, but I'll let you know when it happens. next year.
Thank you for the presentation. I was thinking about if you have multiple consumers downstream, do you then involve them in the incident space? Or how do you communicate it out if it's a lot of people that are affected?
So when this will usually be, you talk about external facing data, customer facing data, or is this sort of like within stakeholders within the company? So good question. We don't actually, the data team don't have to communicate externally. We just communicate within the company. And we have a channel that essentially is, shows up a message that says like, new incident created, this thing is going on. So if someone sees a message pop up in that channel, they can be like, oh, I see something is wrong with like the data right now. And that is the best way that we could communicate that something's going wrong. They can absolutely jump in. If they are curious about the incident and wants to know like, what is going on, like how close are you to fixing it, they can look at the channel and look at the conversation that is ongoing. And also, contribute, ask questions. Maybe they know why it broke. That would be very, very helpful.
Typically, when there are data issues, it can happen further upstream. This can affect multiple departments with different stakeholderships. How do you work in having two different incident response teams going at the same time? Is there a hierarchy that needs to be followed, or is there a general rule of communication between the incident managers?
For the same incident or for?
Yeah, but because it's so far upstream, it has effects downstream, and those downstream effects are what tipped us off to the problem upstream. There's, imagine two different teams are affected. There's two Slack channels that have now been started. You've got between 3 and 4 people involved in managing the incident. How do you see that being managed?
I would say that if it seems to have the same root cause, you should merge those two, because that is technically the same incident. And if they have two different root causes, keep those separate, have two different incident leads, and have those two different discussions happening at the same time. Do we bring in both stakeholderships? What we do is that we don't necessarily, how to put this? We might let someone know if something is happening, but usually they will know first and they will join in before we can let them know, at least internally in the company.
I'm curious if you ever are tempted to have side chats. Like I wouldn't necessarily want all my information on this public channel, or maybe transparency is better. I'm guessing that's the answer, but just curious if that's ever attempted for people on your team.
Yes, at that point it might be worth. I know in Slack you can create a private channel, and I think that would be worth doing if you feel like this is not something or information that the entire company should know about. And I would recommend then having a private conversation that is still in a channel and not in DMs. Does that make sense? All right. Oh. I think we have time for one more.
I guess this kind of assumes that you have a decent way of actually intaking incidents, and then I'm curious if you're tracking your incidents separately from larger scale projects.
Yes, we do consider them to be, they are still workload, obviously, but we don't really have a project that is called just general incident work. They are just a thing that we know that might affect larger projects. They might affect the data responder, but they are not sort of, we don't put aside time to specifically look at incidents. It's not like, 10 hours this week is going to go to instance. It is something that just lies around all the larger scale projects that we want to do. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right, I think time is up, but thank you very much for coming.